Hi, friends. So we're going to continue looking at some of the psychological and sociological reasons why genocide continues to happen. Specifically today, we're going to be looking at the concept of the bystander effect, which I think some of you have been exposed to in working in middle school and elementary school when you talk about bullying. Okay, so the question is, why do people fail to intervene when something bad is happening? Now, as I read through a number of your posts in response to the Rwandan genocide, I noticed that that was a pattern that you talked about a lot, that it was in evaluating the response of the international community when the Rwandan genocide happened, many of you said it really, we really kind of stood back and did nothing, or we kind of believed that someone else would jump in and do something. Okay, what you are describing is actually the bystander effect. So let's take a look at that a little bit and just dig into how that's actually a real phenomenon that occurs when people see something happening to someone where they're being victimized. So the definition of a bystander is a person who's present at an event without participating in the central actions of the event. So when you learned about this, as you talked about bullying in some of your middle school and elementary school lessons, you were probably thinking about someone who sees someone being picked on, or who sees someone being mean to someone else, or who sees a pervasive pattern of harassment, and you don't report it, you don't say anything to the person, you don't stick up for the person. So that's really similar. It's the definition of a bystander. Sometimes by not getting involved, what we're doing is we're saying we're okay with what's happening. Okay, we're not the ones doing it, so we feel like, well, we're not really the bad guy, but we're okay with it happening. When we think about genocide, bystanders are countries, individuals, groups, organizations, governments, government leaders, citizens in government who see what's happening in the news and say, well, yeah, I'm okay with that happening. It's not me. I'm not the one doing it, so I'm not the bad guy. Okay, so this is how it becomes complex. All right, so the bystander effect was really something that was, the term was coined in the 1960s by social psychologists, okay, when a murder occurred in New York. And what happened was this woman was killed outside of her apartment, and people saw it happen, and they were looking out their window and they were passing by, and this was actually like everyone saw it happen, but they didn't step in to call the police or assist. They just kind of were like, well, that's not my problem. Now, one of the reasons why the social psychologists said that this continues to happen is because something that we refer to as diffusion of responsibility. So if I'm the only person who sees a murder happen, I am more likely to call the police. But if there are about 20 or 30, imagine like there are a whole bunch of people walking by, or there's someone looking out their window and I see somebody walking down the street and somebody over there, somebody driving by in their car, and they turn and they look and they see this awful thing happening. And I'm also one of them. What's my thought going to be? Right. Someone else will call the police. Someone else will get involved. I don't have to do it because there's all these other people. We think of that. You've learned of the term diffusion in your science classes when you put a droplet of something of a substance into like a liquid, and what happens to all the particles? Well, it diffuses. It spreads out. Okay. So I put a spoonful of salt in. All of the particles of salt spread out, and it becomes salt water. That's what diffusion of responsibility is. It's the same thing. So if there's a murder happening and I'm watching it, but there are all these other people watching it as well, the responsibility doesn't feel like it's on me anymore because it's been spread out among all these people. So one thing, we're going to take a look at some video clips, and I want you to think about who the bystander is and who steps out of the role of the bystander to actually intervene. But before we do that, I want to share with you a story about how I have taught this in the past when we had everybody together in the classroom. One of the things I would do, and this is something that all my students always remember, and I thought about doing it today, but then I was like, well, I would hate for the people at home to miss out on this. So I'll just tell you about it. Before I teach this lesson, essentially what I would do is I would walk in with a giant stack of books and papers and immediately trip and fall, and everything would go everywhere, and I would lay on the floor still, as though I were hurt. And we would just wait and see what happens. So if you can predict what probably happened or what you would do if you saw your teacher fall and lay there on the floor like they can't get up, well, a number of things would happen. Some students would stay in their seats while Mrs. Sheeler laid there incapacitated on the floor. Some students would be like laughing a little bit because it's awkward, which is understandable. Some people would, I normally have a couple of people come over to me and step out of the role of bystander and say, are you okay, Mrs. Sheeler? Are you okay? Some of my students were so cute. They would be like, it's going to be okay, Mrs. Sheeler, just breathe. Just super caretakers. Like I could cry talking about them. Just so sweet. And that's how all of you would be, I'm sure. One time, though, I didn't inform the nurse's office that I was doing this. I learned to always inform the nurse's office. One time, they actually, one of the students ran down to the nurse's office and reported it, and they came up with a wheelchair and everything, and I had to like get up and be like, sorry, it's just a hoax. It was part of the lesson. But the point is, that's an example of bystander effect. When there's all these students in the room, many of them would be like, well, I'm not even close to her. Like there's 5 people sitting near her, they can help her. It's diffusion of responsibility. Whereas I personally believe that every single one of those students who sat there in their seat and just kind of laughed or was like awkward, didn't know what to do, if it had just been me and them, and I had fallen and looked hurt, they were the only other person in the room, I know for a fact they would have intervened. So that's something to think about, diffusion of responsibility when we talk about how genocide happens. All right, so let's take a look at this clip. Okay, so now I'd like you to be thinking about conclusions that you can draw about bystanders. How does this concept, diffusion of responsibility and the bystander effect, help us to understand what causes genocide? And how does it help us to understand the things that actually could be done to stop genocide from happening? So I'm going to have you guys discuss this in your discussion post.